Every once in a while, when I'm speaking out and about, I find myself going, I can't believe I'm talking about this. And today's conversation on the BreakPoint podcast, we might get into some of those moments where we're talking about some pretty incredible stuff that the technological future holds for us. Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. My guest today is Jacob Shatzer. Jacob, PhD from Marquette University, an assistant professor and associate dean in the School of Theology and Missions at Union University. And being at Union, in fact, in the acknowledgments of a new book that he has written, he mentions a name of a guy that we've had here on the BreakPoint podcast before, a guy that had a big influence in my thinking about the relationship of theology and culture, especially when it comes to what it means to be human and technology. And that's Ben Mitchell. Jacob, sounds like Ben had a little bit of an influence on your life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben is one of the great joys of being at Union University is to get to be just down the hall from Ben Mitchell. And indeed, Ben has been a major influence on my life over the past decade or so, including even my choice to attend and study at Marquette.
Well, one of the, Ben, I think, was the first person that ever introduced me to the very term transhumanism. And your book is called Transhumanism and the Image of God. And really, it was that journey into the emerging challenges of technology and how fast technology was running ahead of our ethics on all kinds of levels, and how deeply it was integrating with all of life that made me start thinking about worldview, not just in terms of our beliefs about kind of the classic, where do we come from? What's wrong with the world? How do we fix it? And what gives meaning and purpose to life? But to add that category, what's a human person? Because really, in our technological impulse, you see a pretty dramatic set of assumptions about what a human being is, and it's nothing like the image of God. And that's where I want to talk about today. And your book does a great job of that. Again, the book is called Transhumanism and the Image of God, Today's Technology and the Future of Christian Discipleship. Some people are going to be listening here, Jacob, and thinking, transhumanism, what are you guys talking about? Particularly that word trans is a little bit loaded in our cultural moment. So I think we need to define it. But you start the book with a terrific illustration of how the kind of the vision of the future that we owe to the Jetsons is not really the future that we're actually heading into. And it's a very important distinction. So I'm hoping that you can kind of walk us through why the Jetsons were wrong as a way of defining transhumanism for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this book by Michael Bess called "Make Way for the Superhumans," in which he deals with some of these changes and the bio enhancement and things like that. And in that book, he talks about the Jetsons fallacy, which I just found to be a profoundly helpful illustration of this problem that I think that we fall into. Now, according to Bess, the Jetsons fallacy is this idea that the future will be populated by wonderful technology, amazing things, flying cars, robots that do our housework, things like that. But humans will be basically the same. If you have watched any episodes of the Jetsons, it's very similar to other sitcoms. The foibles that the humans get into, they're basically the same, even distantly in the future. The reason that Bess calls this a fallacy is because he argues, not from a Christian perspective, but just from a secular perspective, that technology is going to profoundly change us. And so in the future, we're not just going to be the same, but with household robots, we're going to be very different.
Well, and that's the vision of transhumanism. So just define the term for us.
Yeah, so transhumanism is the idea that we are in the process of changing ourselves to something beyond what we currently define as human. So transhumanism is basically the philosophical perspective that this change is inevitable, it's good, it's something that we should take control of and pursue in order to become who we think we need to be.
Well, and I know a lot of people are listening to this going, why are we talking about this? This doesn't impact me. I don't believe that. I don't think that. But there is a level of a transhumanist impulse that has deeply embedded our culture. And really, even in that word, you can hear the worldview implications, right? So in a sense, this is a very consistent vision for the future with a Darwinian evolutionary kind of story of the world, right? That really, the fittest survive, and we figure out how to adapt, and then species, we move on past certain species, or these species become better and better and better. But at this point, there's a level of kind of controlling the evolutionary process to take us beyond, or so that we can transcend our human. Would that be an accurate way to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are certainly elements of transhumanism that Christians would immediately disagree with. Most Christians would immediately disagree with in America today, and that's actually why I think that transhumanism is something that we need to pay attention to. When we first hear about it, we think, okay, it's devoted to this Darwinian evolutionary perspective that thinks that there's not really any such thing as human per se. To be human is just to be changing. And so we would say, well, we disagree with that. We think that there is something about being human rooted in the image of God. So we must not be transhuman. And then we also think about these sci-fi scenarios that are made popular in various movies and Netflix shows and TV shows. Black Mirror, for instance, where there are these dystopian future realities where perhaps people have been uploaded into machines or whatever the case may be, and we think, oh, I certainly don't want that. I must not be transhuman. But it's these worldview implications that you mentioned that I think are so important, because I think when we begin to peel back the way that we actually engage with technology today, we're actually all more transhuman than we think we are. And many of the ways that we engage with technology are actually closer to the way a transhumanist would engage with technology than maybe an Orthodox Christian should.
I want to get to those ways, because that's a huge, huge part of the inevitability thesis. That's part of the kind of the transhumanist vision, is that we're not going to say no to technology. And it's clear that most of us aren't going to say no to technology. But talk a little bit about the sorts of technologies ultimately that some of these visionaries believe would take us beyond our human future. You mentioned some of the movie things, but in terms of downloading into machines and technology and so on, there's also the genetic factor, being able to kind of build better humans. Walk us through some of the technologies that are kind of en route right now that are kind of driving us to this future.
Yeah, so what I try to do in the book is I try to walk from kind of the closest to what we would consider human to the furthest away, and kind of to build this spectrum with kind of 3 steps. So in the first step, I talk about what transhumanists refer to as morphological freedom, which is just the freedom, the ability to change whatever it is about ourselves that we want to change. Now, this can use all kinds of current technologies. I mean, one of the examples that I draw on a lot is a seemingly absurd example, but it's the idea that if somebody wanted to have a robotic tail implanted into them so that they could have a tail, they should have the freedom to have a tail, right? So this, of course, few of us probably think we want a tail, so it seems absurd. But there are all sorts of technologies that are beginning to merge the just kind of add on machine features to the human body, whether that's implantable chips or whether that's just changing other aspects of our body for enhancement. The second step then is kind of more extreme versions of that, where it might be kind of the merging between human and machine through technologies that the technical term that is often used is a hybronaut, or leading to augmented reality, which basically means we merge ourselves with machines to such a degree that the way we interact with the world fundamentally changes. So this can be anything from, we might encounter it as wearable technology, Google Glass, which was in the news more a few years ago, ways that technology can just be merged with our everyday reality. And then, of course, there's kind of the ultimate extreme of mind uploading, or uploading our consciousness into machines, which is something that technologically experts still disagree on whether that's even possible, or how it might be achieved, or what it would do. But those are kind of the 3 steps that I try to highlight, that I think we can kind of connect some different technologies to. As far as what's coming, it's always fun to be a futurist and to guess. I think that actually, I try to not guess very much, simply because I think that the real problem is what faces us today, and it's how we choose to interact with what we actually can interact with today that will shape us into the type of people that we will be in the future when those new realities are possible, the realities that we're not even sure of. So as far as, I guess, what some of those current technologies would be, I think one of the most important technologies that we all interact with day to day is the smartphone, and the degree to which we are actually using the smartphone to augment our reality. And so much of our being is through a phone or connected to this device. I think that the wearable the Google Glass, like I mentioned earlier, that kind of overlay that's becoming more and more possible as the very way we look at and see the world will be overlaid with technology, I think is significant as well. And even the way we think about, I don't deal with this a lot in the book, but I think if it's something I want to explore further, and that's just what's available to us with pharmaceuticals, the way drugs that people can fairly easily obtain, whether they're using them for medical purposes or off-label purposes, can change the way that we are and the way that we live and move.
And we also have the biological aspect, right? I mean, CRISPR technology was in the news because of the reports coming out from the Chinese scientist. I think Dr. He, I think is what was his name, kind of genetic manipulation and the promises that holds. But I think you're right that, most transhumanists are kind of coming at it from artificial intelligence, computer technology, integration with machine sort of way. One of the interesting things to me is, again, when I first heard about this, you kind of have this image of guys in their basements that are trying to do all kinds of crazy things and not getting forward. But then you start seeing kind of the list of people who've actually signed on and call themselves, especially in the early days. I mean, this is 15, 20 years ago, who embraced this term, who really saw their role in technological development as being kind of driving this future forward. And you're talking about, chief researchers, VPs at, major tech companies. I mean, Google, Microsoft, and so on. So this isn't a kind of those kind of really fully advocating this kind of new future. They're not just guys in their mom's basements, are they?
Yeah. I mean, there was an article in Christianity Today now about 3 years ago called "The Imago Dei Meets Superhuman Potential," and in this article, it names people like Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, and Larry Page of Google. These are people who are investing billions of dollars into these innovations, and these are people who are connected to things that we use every day. So even if we think that we are not on with that project, the fact that we are connected to it might mean that some of our data is being used in the service of that kind of a project or those sorts of things. So again, that I think you highlight that well. Part of the problem with transhumanism is we think it's just so fringe. And part of why I wrote this book and why I was interested in this book is not because I think I'm going to completely solve it 100% and close it and fix everything. But I just want to draw people's attention to it because I think it has profound worldview implications. It has profound discipleship implications. And the way we make these choices today is going to shape who we are and who our children are in 10, 20, 25 years when some of these more extreme options perhaps become available.
My guest on today's BreakPoint podcast is Jacob Shatzer. He's a professor and associate dean in the School of Theology and Mission at Union University. And his new book is called Transhumanism and the Image of God. Let's jump in, Jacob, to something we started talking about earlier, which is, look, you can say this isn't me. This isn't part of my life. I certainly, that's fringe. That's out there. But, this is a slow journey in a direction that we've been on this trajectory as a society for a long time. I remember Saturday Night Live, there was an opening monologue just I think last year, I don't know if you saw this. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I'm blanking out on it, but he basically said, "Do you know how much time we spend today proving to robots that we're not robots?" It was just this funny line. Like every time we get on a website, are you a robot? And we're talking to a robot that is vetting us so that we can get on a website as a real human. So, I mean, this is just part of our lives. And there's a level of technological habits that we've kind of embraced. I think about the times I used to drive around the country with a map. I could not literally do that. I mean, you just get so reliant on the convenience and the ease of technology. And, it slowly integrates more and more and more. But we're not going back. That's the hard part, right? So what are the habits that we need to pay close attention to? And what are the things that we need to embrace? There's all kinds of where do we draw the line questions when it comes to us and technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think at some level, there are these larger things that I think are easier for us to still maintain. That's something that we should stay away from. The sacredness of the womb and staying away from CRISPR technology and things like that, I think seem more obvious. But I think when it comes to some of these more everyday realities that we face now, it's a little more difficult than that, because I don't think we can quite make a list and say this one you should never use, this one you always should. But we also don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that technology is neutral, right? So that's one thing that I try to draw out in this work and really help people see, is that technology is not neutral. We can't just pretend that we are so super powerful and can always just choose to use tools for good or evil. There's some truth to that. We recognize in our daily reality, we face choices that we know, I could use this and do bad, I could use this and do good. But we fail to see that technology, it does shape us a little bit. It does nudge us in certain directions. One of my favorite quotes that I found in doing research for this book is by a journalist named Michael Harris, who in his book, The End of Absence, he writes, quote, "Every technology will alienate you from some part of your life. That is its job. Your job is to notice. First, notice the difference, and then every time choose." And what I think Harris draws out there that is so important is to help us see that technology is not neutral. It is going to shape us. It is going to nudge us in directions. And if we ignore that, we are just being nudged. And sometimes it's much stronger than that, as more and more news comes out about how much social networking and things like that is incorporating behavior modification and ads and all those sorts of things. It's more than nudging. We're starting to realize that. And so we have to notice the difference that technology makes, and then we have to choose. And one of the good news, one of the aspects of good news about the Christian tradition, I think, is that we actually have something substantive to help us make choices. It's not simply who do we want to be? Hey, let's just figure this out for ourselves. But we have a God who took on flesh, who dwelt among us. We have Christ to look to shape our values, to shape what it means to be human, and then we can begin to negotiate together in Christian communities and families how our technology is nudging us toward or away from Christ-likeness, rather than this blanket notion of progress or something like that.
Well, it's that blanket notion of progress I want to talk about, because I think the worldview implications. We talked about it, in terms of the question of origin, and the kind of the evolutionary narrative that kind of our transhumanist impulses just kind of flow right along with. But there is a utopian impulse here too, right? I mean, that we're going to use technology well, that it's always going to make it better, that better is the definition of better is either that we have more control or that things are more convenient. And I love that idea of a trade-off, that every time you embrace a technology, you're losing control over something, or you're being alienated from something. That's a very important, I think that's a very important point. And it also tells us how much our worldview is shaped in our culture kind of by this utopian narrative. And I mean, we just came out of the 20th century. What could go wrong with utopianism, right? I mean, there's there's blind spots that are created, throughout the throughout the process. In the book, you make a distinction too that I thought was really helpful, which was the distinction between stewardship and control. I think it was control. You might have used a different word, but I often think about Craig Gay's Way of the Modern World in his book, where he talks about kind of the impulse of secularization is that we're in control of the world. The world's a place of our own making, which is a very different impulse than stewardship. Talk about the difference there between those two concepts, or whatever word it was that you used in the book. Sorry if I just put a word in your mouth.
Yeah, no. Control is an incredibly important term, I think, for Christian discipleship today. And first of all, Craig Gay has been someone who's influential on my thinking as well. I read that book as a senior in college, and it changed the way I thought about worldview. And actually, he just published a book on technology called Modern Technology and the Human Future that came out last year that's quite good as well. And this notion of control, I actually I wrote my dissertation on a theologian named A.J. Conyers, who was a founding faculty member of Truett Seminary. And Conyers was someone who was very astute at analyzing the modern world and some of the lies that the modern world disciples us into. And the notion of control is something that he developed quite a bit. This idea that we can get to know the world around us so that we can control the world, that we can control our lives. And this is the narrative of technology today, that we don't realize that control is a bad word in many ways. We Christians don't live with the hope that we can finally get in control. We live with the hope that we worship a God who is in control, that we submit ourselves to a Lord who is in control of the universe. It is good news to Christians that we are not in control, that another is in control. Now, that, of course, doesn't throw out that we are responsible moral agents who do have some limited control that God gives us. Those are important things. I don't want to deny that. But we live in a world that just assumes more control equals better. And that's the way technology is evaluated. That's one of the ways that the narrative of progress is told. Control is always good. So if something gives us more control over ourselves, over our environment, over others, that's a good thing. And so I think part of what we have to do is just call this issue to mind and realize that there are words that we should be careful of. In teaching, one of my favorite classes to teach is Christian doctrine, and I've taught it at a few different universities. And one of the things I try to do with students is teach them words to be allergic to. And one of the words that they, of course, learn to be allergic to when we talk about the Trinity is to never say that there are three parts of God. I tell them, don't use the word parts. When you hear the word parts, just don't use that. And it's funny because during the course, I noticed that students start not wanting to use the word parts at all, ever. They'll catch themselves, even in appropriate contexts, because they remember, oh, that's a word I'm supposed to watch out for. And I think that as Christians today, as we try to be faithful with the technology and the good that technology can do, control is one of those words that we need to develop, maybe not an allergy to, maybe not a complete suspicion of, but at least more care in noticing and thinking carefully about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you think about the march across America right now of doctor-assisted suicide, and the march across the West of all kinds of kind of doctor-assisted death in one way or another. And it's really these kind of myths of control and convenience, especially, I think, that have poisoned the well. And this is where it directly impacts our thinking about what it means to be human, what makes someone a person of value, what's a good life, what's a life worth living, is if you lose control and you're inconvenient, that in all of our minds, kind of as West, and it's not just technology, it's also, I think, about consumerism and our kind of addiction to stuff, and we want stuff that makes our life, more convenient and puts us in control. But that stuff really has a kind of a heart-shaping, a vision-shaping influence, and it drives all kinds of other ethical issues, it seems to me, in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I got a call right in the middle of that thought, so it didn't end in a question. So if you want to just play that transition up, that would be fun. So. You had nothing to add there? Okay, we'll keep going.
I don't
All
think
right.
so.
The
Yeah.
good news is all of this will be edited. Yeah. All right, cool. Let me think where I wanted to go next. I'll just do another transition, Steve. My guest is Jacob Shatzer. He's a professor at the School of Theology and Missions at Union University and the author of a new book, Transhumanism and the Image of God. And Jacob, here we're just kind of pushing to the end of our time, but I guess I just want to ask you this. What would you, I hate to say, give 3 things or 4 or 5 things to Christians on how they can navigate this kind of new world and develop better habits and so on, because that kind of smacks of control. Like if you do these 3 things, you'll get the result you're looking for. But what do you think? Let me put it this way then. What does faithful Christian living and discipleship look like in a culture that's in many ways largely embraced this transhumanist future?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. One of the challenges is that as soon as we think that we have the 3 steps that we can take, we're actually falling into a technological solution to a deeper problem. And so at some level, what I want to help people see is to just notice. And I don't know if noticing is a habit, but I just want to help all of us insert more distance between ourselves and our technology as much as we can, and to invite critique from others. Oftentimes it's the people that we're around most in our life, whether it's our family or colleagues at work or friends at church, who, if we had an honest conversation with, they might be able to point out some ways that technology is forming us to be worse community members, worse people, and be willing to ask those questions, be willing to hear those answers, and be willing to think critically. So I think notice is one thing that we can cultivate. Another is to just be imaginative. We tend to think that there's an inevitability to it. I mean, and you mentioned earlier in the podcast, we can't rewind, right? We can't rewind and go back to the way things were 50 years ago. And I think that's certainly true. We can't do that. We don't want to make that the answer. But at the same time, we don't want to assume that we know what 50 years from now is going to be and that we have to go along the trail to that. And so even the use of smartphones, when I started this research and started writing this book a few years ago, smartphones were still on the rise. And it was only in the later stages of writing this book that the research began to come out showing some of the downsides to screen time for children, for instance. And even now, it's kind of I have 4 young children, and I feel like now there's more critique among parents of how much screen time they should allow their kids. Whereas when my oldest, who's now almost 10, when he was really young, there was just, hey, look, there are all these games kids can play on iPads, woohoo! But today it's not quite like that. Many parents are recognizing that there are problems associated with that. And so I think that as studies come out and show more of a complex picture of what screen time does to us, I do think people are going to begin to imagine other ways of negotiating our technological reality. And so I know that waiting and depending on studies is probably another technological problem too. I don't think we have to wait for the studies to come out. In fact, one of the authors that I read basically said, look, there are a lot of alarming things about screen time. If you want to wait for all the studies to come out to really show it, you're going to need to wait 10 or 20 years for the data to come in, and your kids are going to be all grown up. So if you want to wait and see, but maybe change. And so I think that there's already some movement where people are beginning to imagine different ways. So I think Christians should notice. Christians should imagine different ways of being, and Christians should finally focus on God's word and on God's people and on being the church. Technology does not change the call to be conformed to the image of Christ, connected to a body of God's people in a local place, in a local expression. So I think to the degree that technology makes us think we can stop going to church or stop being part of a local body, we should realize that that is drawing us away from God's plan for discipleship, God's plan for making us into the image of Christ, which is through the body of Christ and being a part of it. So I think if we if we do those things, if we notice, if we imagine, and if we focus on what God has given Christians for centuries for discipleship and growth in Christ likeness, that'll put us in a better position to be faithful to Christ, not faithful to this notion of progress or control.
Well, that's a terrific way to encourage us here at the end, Jacob. Technology gives us so many shortcuts, but it doesn't provide a shortcut to following Christ. It doesn't provide a shortcut to being fully formed into the image of Christ. So a great book. Thanks for writing it. I really mean that. It's a topic that is just out of sight, out of mind for so many people. But it does reveal, I think you've done a great job revealing this trajectory that we're on in our embrace of the technologies that are around us. Again, the book's called Transhumanism and the Image of God, Transhumanism and the Image of God. If you come to breakpoint.org, click on the homepage, the button there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to this book, as well as some other ways that you can follow the work of Jacob Shatzer. He's the author of this book and a professor and associate dean at Union University. And Jacob, it's been a great conversation. Thanks for writing the book, and thanks for joining us on the BreakPoint podcast.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate your ministry.